Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. Thanks for joining us for this very timely discussion on the U.S.-China relationship. My name is Joel Scanlon. I'm Executive Vice President here at Hudson, and we are honored to have with us Congressman John Moolenaar, Chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. Under Chairman Moolenaar's leadership, the Select Committee continues to play a vital role investigating, raising public awareness about, and emphasizing the urgency of the multifaceted threats posed by the CCP to our economic and national security and that of our partners and allies. From infiltration of American universities leading scientific and technological research, to exploiting vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, to theft of intellectual property and subversion of export controls, to the competition for leadership in AI, to China's military buildup, and increasingly belligerent behavior toward Taiwan that risks a new world war. More than that, through the committee's work, the chairman is leading a bipartisan effort to develop policy solutions that often require delicate balance, in-depth understanding of the potential costs and trade-offs, and coordination with allies. And perhaps above any of those accomplishments is his strategic clarity. After his remarks this morning, the chairman will be in conversation with my colleague, Senior Fellow David Feith. We're deeply grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, and the entire Select Committee for your steadfast leadership on the most important national security challenge of our time. Thank you. Welcome to Hudson.
Thank you very much, Joel, and good morning, everyone. And I want to thank the Hudson Institute for bringing together such a distinguished group of thinkers and leaders. That's you. You know, Hudson has always been, and for a long time, been a home for serious ideas and for courage. And I want to start today by recognizing a painful reminder of why our work together matters. Last week, Pastor Jinmin Gui, the founder of the Zion Church, one of China's largest underground congregations, was detained by Chinese authorities at his home in Beijing. His son-in-law, Bill Drexel, works here at Hudson, and many of you know Bill. And I had a chance to meet with Bill's wife recently to hear firsthand about their family's experience. And that connection really brings this issue closer to home. It reminds us that the Chinese Communist Party's aggression is not an abstract thing. It affects real people, people of faith, of conscience, of courage. And let me say clearly, America has and always will stand with those who are persecuted for their beliefs. And we will not allow the CCP to silence the voices of faith and freedom, not in Beijing, not in Hong Kong, and not anywhere the party's reach extends. The United States and the Chinese Communist Party are locked in a contest that will shape the century ahead, not simply for markets or for influence, but for the rules and values that govern the modern world. The CCP has made the expanse of its ambitions unmistakably clear. Xi Jinping's government has fused economic, technological, and military power into a single system of control, one that uses innovation to crush individuals and entrench the party's authority. They're building a surveillance state as they export repression abroad while consolidating control at home. And they are doing so with the help of Western technology, semiconductors, software, and tools originally designed for progress that are now being used and turned towards repression. That's the challenge we face, ensuring that America's openness, ingenuity, and free enterprise are never again weaponized to strengthen an authoritarian rival. We cannot afford complacency or nostalgia. Engagement has not moderated the CCP, it has emboldened it. And while economic ties have grown, so too has Beijing's willingness to threaten our allies, steal our technology, and undermine international norms. We must build a new framework that preserves and expands U.S. technological leadership while ensuring that those same technologies cannot be turned against us. AI chips, and in particular, who should be able to buy them, has been a hot topic in Washington, D.C. lately. The primary point of contention has focused on what U.S. companies should be allowed to sell to China. These have focused on U.S. chip capability as the bar for determining the right threshold. Some have suggested 50% less than the best U.S. chip is the right line, a U.S. minus strategy, if you will. I believe this is backwards. If we're to implement a system that both keeps China locked on U.S. technology and protects national security, we must limit the uplift we give China's AI sector as much as possible. The American innovation system has created companies that are generations ahead of their Chinese counterparts in AI hardware. We cannot hand our strategic adversary a shortcut in developing better AI models to extend their repressive reach. Instead of using U.S. chip capability as the bar, we must set it off China's capability at scale to determine allowable sales, a China plus strategy. Our companies can sell to Chinese customers, but limited in capability to slightly above China's indigenous ability. Additionally, the key to AI advancement is aggregate compute, and China could continue to challenge the U.S. in AI even with less capable chips if there's no limit to how many they can buy. Therefore, we must limit the total computing power the Chinese market is able to accumulate to 10%. 10% of the U.S. to make sure that we maintain and expand our lead in AI. This rolling technical threshold, or RTT, that we've proposed would implement this strategy. Instead of static rules tied to one model or benchmark, the RTT would set a dynamic line, always a step ahead of what China can produce domestically. It would ensure that our technology stays out of the hands of the People's Liberation Army while preserving U.S. companies' market advantage and enabling them to generate revenue to invest in research and development. To put it simply, China's capabilities should never be allowed to catch up to ours, and the RTT keeps them perpetually dependent on U.S. technology, on our design, our software, and our manufacturing know-how. I want to make it clear, though, this is not about punishing Chinese people. The people of China, we love the people of China, but it's defending our own security. It's about protecting the tools of freedom and preventing them from being tools of repression. But export controls alone are not enough. To sustain this advantage, we must strengthen every link in our own system. That means accelerating domestic semiconductor manufacturing, investing in critical minerals and supply chains, and aligning policy with allies from the Netherlands and Japan to South Korea and Taiwan, so that the CCP cannot exploit gaps that exist between us. We must also enforce our laws with resolve. The CCP state-backed firms continue to target American innovation through joint ventures and shell companies. That's why the Select Committee is working with colleagues in both parties to update our investment screening tools, close loopholes, and modernize enforcement capacity across commerce, treasury, and defense. The CCP plays the long game, but history shows that when free nations act with purpose, we outlast every tyrannical regime. Our strategy must be comprehensive, strong enough to deter, smart enough to endure, and principled enough to win. When China detains pastors like Jin McGree for worshiping, when it imprisons Uyghur Muslims for praying, when it disappears journalists or silences business leaders, it shows the world exactly what kind of a system it represents. Our task is to make sure that the 21st century is not defined by that model, that the tools of our artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing are governed by free societies that value human dignity. The rolling technical threshold and the broader strategy it represents are part of that fight. They ensure that America's leadership in technology strengthens the free world rather than eroding it. The CCP believes America is too divided, too distracted, too dependent to lead. They believe we no longer have unity or the will to defend what we stand for. But I believe the opposite. Across party lines and across generations, Americans understand that the defense of freedom begins with clarity. Clarity about what we value and what we're willing to protect. As long as we stay focused, disciplined, and united, the CCP will remain dependent, not dominant. America will remain the indispensable leader of the free world. I want to thank you very much for being with me today.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's a great privilege for me to be here with you, Chairman Moolenaar, and great to be at Hudson. Hudson has led on many of these issues for a long time. Hudson is now the think tank home to your predecessor as chairman of the China Select Committee, Mike Gallagher, who explains that today he is but a software salesman at Palantir, but he and you and your colleagues, really on a bipartisan basis, have been invaluable for leading us. Why don't we start the discussion with a sense of where the competition with the CCP is overall, in your view? You know, in a lot of senses, we can date sort of the awakening of American thinking back about 10 years. Some of the late Obama administration, certainly the election of President Trump. You know, Mike Pence spoke from this stage as vice president in 2018 about strategic competition with China. Where do you think we are after 10 years? How do you measure success? Do you have any particular metrics, whether it's defense spending or technology or otherwise, that you would suggest we look to?
Well, it's a great question. You know, because it's a pretty opaque situation with what China's doing and where they are on some of these technologies and military capabilities, even the economic data that we get out of China is very suspect. You know, it's difficult to state with accuracy, but what we do know is 30 years ago, we had the idea that, you know, China would, as it became wealthier, it become more freedom-loving, more democratic, more part of the league, you know, the world of nations that respected rule of law. And what we've seen is just the opposite. Under Xi Jinping, they've become more repressive, both at home, abroad. Through their Belt and Road Initiative, they've created a debt trap diplomacy that, you know, we see that in Africa, we see it in the Americas. And so they've become much more aggressive in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, you know, being ready to take Taiwan by force if necessary. And so we've seen them increasingly grow more aggressive. We've known for years that they've been investing in, you know, more engineers, you know, basically more STEM fields. And I can remember, you know, 20 years ago hearing about the number of engineers that were produced by universities in China. And of course, we had universities collaborating very closely on research, even funded by our Department of Defense, Department of Energy. Now, what we've also learned, though, is that their dual-use technologies, their military-civil fusion, their national security laws have changed, you know, just in the last several years, where basically any Chinese national, wherever they are in the world, is under the threat of, if they don't comply with whatever the CCP requires them to do, they are violating national security laws. And so you see this growing repression. And I would just say in the last week, with the critical minerals and their willingness to shut off basically, you know, access to technology areas that we are dependent on in our military and our manufacturing, their true intent is really coming to the surface. And I would say in America, whereas when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, there was a Sputnik moment and suddenly it was all hands on deck in the United States. I believe in the last week we saw a threat economically, militarily, and basically showing the world what they're willing to do in order to advance their own interests. So I would say it's a huge wake-up call, and I'm excited to be part of this committee that's working in a bipartisan way to try and address this threat.
Why don't we start right there with,
Sure.
with the really rather shocking, rare earths and critical minerals export control threat that Beijing has now put forward. We know that it generated a quick and notable response from President Trump and from his team. You've called for urgent action in statements. What specific action would you want to see from the U.S., from our allies, on the rare earths issue in particular, and perhaps on other issues that are, as you say, are implied by their willingness to threaten kind of a strangling move of this degree?
Well, I think we need to view this not simply as a 1 week strategy from China. I think we have to recognize they're going to continue to run this play over and over again. And so I've been advocating and have some bipartisan legislation that looks at their the PNTR status, their permanent normal trade relation status. I think that should be revoked. I think we should not view them as a normal trading relationship. I also think when it comes to tariffs, if they're selling different products that don't have high value technologically or sensitive technologies, obviously there needs to be some kind of concern in terms of trade dependency, but really where we need to be focusing on critical minerals, AI, advanced technologies, hypersonic missiles, things that they have leverage in our supply chains. And I think we ought to be having a tariff up to 100% on those strategic. And I tend to be a free trader. I mean, that has been, my philosophy all along. But you have free trade with free nations. And when they are exhibiting the kind of subsidies, the kind of strategy that isn't simply to trade technologies and be part of a system, it's really to drive us out of business in different industries. And we've seen them run that play over and over again, and using subsidies, unfair trade practices. And we have to recognize that we need to have a corresponding treatment of them. And so I think the assumptions that we made years ago need to be reevaluated, and we need to send a strong message. And right now is the time to do it, because they are going to continue to run this play over and over again.
Part of the drama, the surprise of Beijing's move last week is that, I think as you might have put it in a public statement, it comes effectively as a slap in the face to President Trump before this expected summit between President Trump and Xi Jinping in the coming weeks. What do you expect out of that summit? What would you like to see out of that summit?
Well, President Trump's a good negotiator, so I don't want to give him advice on negotiations. But I will say that I found it interesting, the terminology that the CCP used is when we're engaged in certain behaviors, we shouldn't be requesting dialogue. That was kind of, basically they were saying, okay, we started this, and they're just simply corresponding, and now we want to talk. I think President Trump has good instincts. He's trying to build a relationship with Xi Jinping. He's trying to find ways, we are, the difference between now and the Cold War that President Reagan, President Bush faced, it was our economies weren't intertwined. Our economies now are intertwined. And so it's a different situation. But I do think that peace through strength policy is the right policy, and we need to be very clear that it shouldn't be to get a short-term, oh, they're willing to sell, magnets and, access to technologies again, because they'll shut that off again whenever it suits their interests. And so I think we need to really reset the entire relationship. And I believe President Trump is capable of doing that. He's got to, always be viewed as someone who's willing to talk. But I think, the idea that, he may go to China, I guess right now I would say, I think it's fine that he meets Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the, gathering. But I would play out some of these policies that we can enact that really address the concern, and then have Beijing wanting to talk with him.
Are there specific things you would like to not see out of a summit? You've been vocal, for example, on some issues that some have reported, might come out of a possible summit, a possible deal between President Trump and Xi Jinping. Things like the possible U.S. licensing of the sale of, slightly modified Blackwell advanced AI chips to China, or possibly a willingness on the part of the U.S. administration to welcome investment in the United States from China in things like automobiles and battery factories, even when that would seem to pose an enormous risk to U.S. automakers. What about those prospects?
Yeah. Well, the whole sale of chips, and I think, in my opening remarks, we talked about this rolling technical threshold that I think is a good strategy. I think we just have to recognize that our goal should not simply to be selling American technology to China. We need to recognize the national security threat. I do think it's important that we are the backbone of these technologies, AI, around the world, but I do think we can get there through a threshold that keeps them at bay. And it's going to be very important that we work with our allies, the Netherlands, Japan, and make sure that, we continue to have this lead in the game. A short-term victory, I come from an agriculture district, and of course, soybeans is something. We don't want to, we want to make sure our farmers are not harmed by retaliation, and we want to do everything we can to, support them. But at the same time, we would never want to trade national security for, more access to the Chinese market for soybeans. The $1 trillion investment, or whatever the amount was that was being floated as, we do not want America to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. To me, you look at what's happening around the world, and China is very strategic in terms of how they invest. I recognize there's a dependency right now on American businesses and our supply chains, but let's do everything we can to get out of that trap rather than deepening the dependency. And so, like in my district, I've been opposed to a Chinese battery plant, Goshen, which is a Chinese company. And normally I'm all excited about jobs that would be coming into my district. But when you see that, Goshen, right in its articles of association, talk about its relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, when you recognize the national security laws that any Chinese national is under, when we've seen in Michigan, my home state, 5 students from the University of Michigan, Chinese nationals, caught outside of Camp Grayling, where they're training military leaders, including Taiwanese military leaders. And the Chinese national students are saying, well, we're here stargazing. Well, the equipment they had, and these students had some amazing equipment to look at the stars right outside of Camp Grayling. We've seen, Chinese nationals bringing in different materials, a fungus that could be used as sort of an agro-terrorist. And again, I don't want to look at every Chinese national in a suspect way, but we do need to focus on the fact that the Chinese government and the laws that the Chinese nationals are under put every Chinese national at risk and are vulnerable to leverage, they or their families. And so we have to really reset our expectations.
We've mentioned export controls on US-designed semiconductor chips. You and your team recently put out this report on semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the importance there too of export controls that would seek to prevent China from having the ability to indigenously manufacture in China the most advanced chips. How do you see that policy area? The second Trump administration has kind of adjusted the policy trajectory on the export controls of AI chips, but stated in places like the AI Action Plan a commitment to keeping export controls and tightening them on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Is that the direction that you see coming likely from the Commerce Department and the White House?
I hope so. I do. I think that is likely. And it requires collaboration. Our investigation, we looked at ASML, the Dutch company. It looked at a Japanese company and 3 American companies. And what we learned is about half of their sales were into China. And not their highest technology, but it does show the interest in China, the commitment that they're making in this area. And we just have to recognize we need to stay ahead of that game and work with our allies. We've already met with some of the Dutch leadership, and we continue to work at those.
One of the most interesting things about that report, I thought, was that you mentioned actually that there are signs of Chinese-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment making inroads into the US market and into semiconductor fabs that we have here at home. That would seem to raise a very interesting and I think important set of questions about not just export controls, which get a lot of discussion, but import controls, which actually don't get discussed much at all, not nearly as much as they should. Do you see, is there an opportunity for import controls, like from the Commerce Department's so-called ICTS authority, on that Chinese-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment? And do you think there might be an opportunity, really a need, for import controls in other areas when it comes to tech that would flow in here from China?
I do think that's very important. And I think when you think of like the CFIUS process, where we're looking at inbound investment, we got to be concerned about outbound investment. We got to be concerned about what's being invested here, and like that. And I can never remember the acronym, so forgive me for.
Yeah, it's painful.
But similar, we don't want to increase our dependency on Chinese technology and having more of our supply chain dependent on that. And so I do think there's a key role, and I think you're right that makes a lot of sense. I will say with the CFIUS process, we've had to continue to revise and update that because it's kind of a moving target, and I'm hoping within the Trump administration there will be opportunities to make sure we stay ahead of the game on this.
It's interesting, that impossible to remember abbreviation, ICTS,
Yes.
Makes the whole policy area, I think, suffer because it's unpronounceable. But it's actually something that had its origin in the first Trump administration. It then continued and was developed in the Biden administration. And it seems that one of the biggest questions for the second Trump administration is how they plan to use what is now, increasingly structured in the Commerce Department as this office of ICTS.
Along those lines, if I could, we've done different reports on, drones and our dependence on drones, and law enforcement. You look at all these areas like 80% of the drones being Chinese. When we look at these cranes that are in our ports, and again, like 80% of these cranes are Chinese, and what we found is that there was a cellular modem on these cranes that wasn't part of the original specification, but the CCP was kind enough to put those so that they could monitor what's going in and out of our ports. When you look at some of these technologies, it's important that we don't further our dependence in this area, and we provide space for American innovation. I've talked to drone manufacturers that got out of the business because China was running the playbook where they said, we want to dominate in this area and we will undercut the price every way possible and drive them out of business. We've seen that with critical minerals, mining, processing, and so it really, whereas I'm very much in favor of free markets, there is a national security imperative that says we do need to have a supply of these critical minerals, and the government needs to step in and address these situations.
It seems drones, cranes, other things that you and your colleagues have shined light on, power inverters across the U.S., power and electrical infrastructure that, come from China, often are found with, rogue hardware that's transmitting home in ways that are not advertised. You had a colleague, Congressman Nunn, who did an open letter recently on the matter of these Chinese crypto mines that are operating all over the United States, and not only have the ability to be surveillance platforms for China, but to sabotage the power grid wherever they are because they demand so much power. And this can be a vector of sabotage, including against the US military facilities that are often next to these crypto mines.
Yeah.
It seems there is, very much to your point, an entire really long list of areas that affect kind of the US consumer economy, where the main instrument for getting at them is the hard to pronounce ICTS authority of the Commerce Department.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen how important it is when it comes to these, Volt Typhoon and some of these areas where our infrastructure is vulnerable. And again, they're playing a long game. It's not like their companies have to be concerned about, shareholders. They have the golden shareholder that, decides what the priorities are over whatever length of time, and are willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish their goals. And so you're right, those kinds of technologies coming into the United States, that's a huge concern.
You mentioned at the top kind of the importance of continuing to welcome some flow of trade from China in non-critical areas, but that critical areas would include things like AI-related technologies. Do you think that the components that go into U.S. data centers is one of them? Because it seems that one area of this piece, of this sort of China technology landscape that is often overlooked, is how much of the hardware that goes into the U.S. AI build-out, which the administration is focused on making sure is dominant over China's AI build-out, actually comes from China. These are servers made from companies in China, and some of them are well known, Foxconn and Pegatron and others, and yet as a policy issue, it's not so well known.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and just to make it, even more accessible to everyday Americans, routers, right? I mean, the dominant position of Chinese routers, was it TP-Link? I mean, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it's so interesting. Our staff director, we were starting to discuss this issue, and I'm thinking, well, I've got a router at home. I don't know what kind it is. And, he was saying, yeah, my mother had a router, and it was TP. And you realize the infiltration there. And again, if it was a normal trading relationship with a friendly nation, you'd say, great, that's a win-win. But with the surveillance capabilities These are just huge concerns. And when you look at the surveillance state that exists in China, that they are trying to export around the world and partner with dictators and oppressive regimes to prop them up as well. On one hand, they're saying, well, we're not involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but we know Russia would not be prosecuting that war were it not for China propping them up with all sorts of resources. So it's just a different day, and it's an opportunity for us as Americans to partner with like-minded countries and also continue to encourage American ingenuity and recognize that we can compete with anybody, but we bought into this idea that China was going to be a reliable partner, and we just have to really re-examine that assumption.
Let's go from critical infrastructure on kind of the telecom, hardware, AI data center side to critical infrastructure on the sort of software and the minds of our children and voters side. What's your view of what we've seen in the news about TikTok and where the administration seems to be going on this divestiture arrangement?
Well, just the history of that, we passed that legislation in Congress. President Biden, I wish he had just let it go dark on January 19th, and we would not be dealing with the same situation. He basically handed President Trump a live grenade starting being sworn in. And so I give the Trump administration credit. They are trying to execute the law, keeping TikTok available, but also under American control. We've requested a briefing and are going to get a briefing on the latest in terms of this, negotiated deal. And I would say it's still very much a work in progress. The things that I've been concerned about are I don't want to see ByteDance having control or even the algorithm. I think that needs to be controlled by, American interests. And, the legislation doesn't specifically preclude ByteDance from, up to 20% ownership. But I think we need to be very clear that we do not want their ability to control the algorithm. I've talked to some of and I'm not a technology expert, but when you hear the technology expert saying that in that algorithm, about half of it, they can't figure out what's in there. And to me, that just, I just believe you have to have a new algorithm. And I don't know that you can reprogram, or I forget how you phrase the term, but so I'm concerned about who controls it and also the algorithm. And, we just got to get the law implemented.
There was news, I think, yesterday from CNN that Frank McCourt, the investor, the former owner of the LA Dodgers, may be considering a lawsuit challenging the administration on this. Would you expect to see things like that?
I've met Frank. I've discussed TikTok with him. I have not heard that he's planning on a lawsuit, but I do think that when it comes to his proposal, he had a proposal along with Mr. Wonderful. What is his name?
Kevin O'Leary.
Kevin O'Leary. And what I liked about it is, McCourt has been in this space. He understands the technology and is really devoted to, advancing technologies that benefit America. And I believe they put forward a proposal. The problem is, at the end of the day, Xi Jinping has the final say on what happens. And so I give our administration a lot of credit for trying to negotiate a win-win scenario. But at the end of the day, Xi Jinping is going to decide his view of what makes them the winner in this. And so what criteria was used by China to not accept that proposal, I mean, I think, those are very reasonable questions. And clearly that would have had American control of the algorithm and American control of the overall direction of the company. So I think he has an interesting point. I can't comment on the legal aspects.
And I know that I want to leave a little bit of time to go to questions from around the room, but before then, I want to ask you a bit about sort of the year-end legislative agenda on a lot of the issues that you've been working on. One of them on outbound investment. You mentioned the importance of scrutinizing not just CFIUS, kind of inbound investment from China, but outbound U.S. investment into China. That's now in as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. What is most important about that, and what are the prospects, you think, for getting that enacted this year? It was barely not enacted last year. Do you think you get it over the line by Christmas this time?
I hope so. We are working very hard to accomplish that. The Senate version, John Cornyn has added that to the NDA in the Senate. We've been working, Andy Barr in the House has been working on it. In the House, we've tried to incorporate some of the technical feedback from the America First investment policy and Treasury and throughout the administration, getting their feedback. And so that will be something that needs to be worked out in conference committee. But I'm really pleased with the progress that's been made on that, on the biosecure. That's another area. We're working on research security. And just to give you, some of my experience, to me, it's been amazing how much we've been able to see our taxpayer dollars, whether it's Department of Defense, Department of Energy, investing in research that is benefiting the Chinese military and their industrial complex. And so we have highlighted that, and we are trying to cut that off. And I think we're going to be successful doing that. A lot of universities have discontinued their joint partnerships with Chinese entities that are affiliated with the PLA. But Wall Street, and this is what makes outbound investment legislation difficult, is, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to make them money. And, they would say, well, we want to be patriotic, but their day job is to make money for their shareholders. And so we need to continue to highlight and make visible the fact that when you are putting American investor dollars investing in entities that partner with the Chinese military or the surveillance state, that is not a patriotic decision, and we need to have clear guardrails on what is acceptable and what isn't. And so my hope is with this outbound investment, we're looking at both sectors as well as entities, different companies. Now, what makes it difficult is these companies, it's like whack-a-mole. You sanction one company and they come up with another name and another. So you have to have both sectors as well as companies that, basically do not invest list. And of course, Wall Street wants clarity. And in this case, that's what we're working through the details. How do you give sort of the red light, green light, eliminate the ambiguity, but accomplish the task? And so that's what we're working on, and I'm confident we'll get it done.
Tell us a bit more about biotech and the Biosecure Act. Why didn't it pass last year? Why might it pass this year?
Last year, in the legislation, we actually listed some specific companies. And of course, different members of Congress are sensitive to having something listed in their district. So, and I've always been a fan of, legislation should be broad. It shouldn't be too targeted, but focused on criteria. So we're taking that approach now, which I think is a stronger approach, and then allows, the executive branch to designate who fits that criteria. And I think it's a better approach. So again, I'm very optimistic. At the end of the day, when it comes to these conference committees and deadlines and who's in the room making the final decision, but I feel that there's bipartisan support now, and I think that people, I think, just in the last year, more and more people are awakened to need for this kind of legislation, and so I'm optimistic.
A final question, and then we'll open it up. I'm curious. The Biosecure Act would seem to get especially at the challenge of things like Chinese companies tied to the Chinese state providing gene sequencing services in the United States that pose an important threat to the sensitive data of Americans. But how do you think we're going, either in the Congress or in the administration, on the pharmaceutical and drug supply chain problem with China, which is related but separate?
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn recently. I hadn't been tracking. There's some awareness that there's something like an 85% or more dependency on China,
Yeah.
the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients of a lot of important drugs.
Yeah.
There's also something like a 90% plus dependence on foreign sources for biologic drugs, which is not so much part of the conversation. We've got a 232 process at the Commerce Department, other measures in the Congress. Do you think we're going to be getting at the danger of vulnerability to drugs that come from China with the speed that we need?
I think that's a huge, supply chain dependency. It's funny, until COVID hit, I don't think supply chain became sort of this, everybody understood the term and why this matters, because, it's always, let's buy it in the least expensive place, where can you manufacture it cheaply so that you get the lowest. But these dependencies that have been created, and it could be critical minerals, all these things, but medicines are right at the forefront of this. And we saw during COVID, China was willing to restrict personal protective equipment and other things when it was in their interests. And you think of the vulnerabilities. You mentioned the active pharmaceutical ingredient and the percentages. Even in countries like India, where we do a lot, there's a supply chain dependency. So, some of the things are made here, some of the things are made here, and they rely on each other. And so, we've had some hearings on that. We want to get a complete picture. And then, once again, working with reliable allies. But China right now is in the midst of that supply chain, and it doesn't surprise me if they would start to leverage that, similar to what they're doing on critical minerals.
Why don't we open it up? Patrick.
Patrick Cronin, Hudson Institute. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your leadership, your clear views today. You talked about maintaining a large dominance in compute power over China. I'm thinking of the President's AI Summit at Carnegie Mellon recently with Senator McCormick and others focused on energy and the compute data centers. But what is it going to take for the United States to try to keep the leadership, not to mention maintain such a dominant position over compute power with China? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a complicated area. And again, it comes to working with reliable partners. The President is talking about UAE and doing something there. And, to me, when you look at the energy capabilities in a country like that would benefit. When you look at the need for guardrails, though, when it comes to who are reliable partners and how do we know that they're not going to allow technology to seep into the CCP's hands. But I do think when it comes to, we do want American technology to be the infrastructure around the world. And we need to partner with like-minded allies to accomplish that. I think in America right now, our energy policies of the last decade have really limited some of our growth. Even if let's say you put 10 nuclear plants online in the next, it'd be 7 to 10 years before you could actually get the electricity. And so I think we need to have a strategy of saying, okay, who can we rely on? Who can we partner with? How can we put the right guardrails in that allow us to continue to advance? And then, kind of like we're doing with critical minerals, saying, okay, what's our strategy to be self-sufficient in these areas? And, I appreciate the focus on energy dominance. I think, the United States does have capabilities. We also have capabilities in critical minerals. But because of basically politics over the last few decades, we got away from, mining, processing, all these different things that are part of this future. And I'm confident we can rebuild that, but it's going to require permitting reform and all sorts of other areas. So, yeah, thanks for your question.
Tim Navarra, Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Thanks for all the interesting information and your leadership. I would like to hear your thoughts on how TikTok is playing a crucial role in the Chinese gray zone and hybrid warfare strategy, and how this places the seed of division within our societies and undermines with that the fight against China. Thank you.
TikTok being so popular with young people, and more young people getting their news from TikTok. And when you realize that the CCP ultimately controls what people see, just in the case of, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you look at the messaging on TikTok, and it was amazing, the messaging that was the political messaging. And you'd have to say, okay, who's behind that? And what's the goal of that political messaging? And a lot of times it's division. It may not be a clear political ideology, but it is clearly an effort to divide Americans. And to me, anytime you have a foreign adversary in charge of your media, which in the case of people who are getting their news on TikTok, you have a foreign adversary in charge of a media. And so I think that's a big part of it. That's where it's important to have the American control of the algorithm.
Hi, Kate Winston with S&P Global Commodity Insights. The president has said that he is willing to impose higher tariffs on China for buying Russian oil, but he's waiting for Europe to do more, and is also sort of waiting to back legislation on that matter. I wonder if you think there is more room for the administration to use more traditional sanctions on Chinese ports or oil terminals that import Russian oil, much the way they do with Iran's imports to China. And if so, are you talking to the administration about that, or is there room for legislation on that?
I would say definitely there is opportunity there. I mean, the port fee increases, they're increasing fees, we're increasing, so there's definitely, and I appreciate, this is not exactly your question, but I appreciated the president putting tariffs based on the fentanyl crisis, because we did an investigation that showed it wasn't simply Xi Jinping not able to control, organized crime in China or turning a blind eye. They actually had a policy that said, we will give a tax rebate to chemical companies in China that manufacture the precursors, the fentanyl precursors. Now, they couldn't get the rebate if they sold it in China. It was illegal to sell it in China. But if they exported it, then they could get a rebate. So President Trump put tariffs on directly related to the fentanyl situation. Now, in the case of, I mean, clearly China is propping up Russia. They talk about the no limits friendship, no limits partnership. You know, they would say they're not involved in the conflict, but every bit of information we get is, you know, they're supplying dual use materials that benefit Russia. They're buying the Russian energy. So I think it's appropriate for there to be consequences. What exactly all the tools are, I would leave that up to the administration, but I think it's important that we send a message and that Europe sends a message. It really has bothered me when I listened to Macron a while back talking about the situation in Ukraine was so concerning that he thought at some point they might even have to send French troops to defend democracy in, you know, Ukraine. And then a week later, he turns around and goes and cozies up to Xi Jinping, trying to find more ways to, and it's like, where's the disconnect there? And so I hope the president can highlight these things, whatever tools make the most sense. But I do think people need to understand China is not a benign actor. And these photo ops with Russian, you know, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, the Iranian leadership. I mean, these are not simply, you know, harmless gatherings. It really shows the heart and kind of the direction they're going.
Here in front.
Thank you very much. Michael Martina from Reuters. I would like to get your assessment of China's motives for this recent critical minerals move. Is this a short-term, there has been some analysis that it's a short-term move to try to, you know, implement some sort of leverage ahead of talks, or do you believe this is a longer-term ambition that they want to codify this sort of regime in you know, their system? Yeah.
I think it was a combination of things. I think it was something, you know, they said it was retaliation for something that we did a week before. You can't put a policy like that together in that short of time. They've been working on this. And I think they chose sort of to launch this idea in order, I mean, I do think it was interesting that when President Trump was working to resolve the situation in the Middle East, that's when they chose to announce this. So I think there was a short-term, I want to get some leverage so that when Xi Jinping meets with President Trump, he agrees to some relief, and isn't he a wonderful guy, and how reasonable they are. So I do think there was that. But I think in the longer term, their goal is to dominate these areas and create a dependency like they're doing in the developing world. And they know our points of vulnerability. And unfortunately, some of our policies have played into that, where we've subsidized, promoted technologies that they are the ones who benefit the most from that. And so I think there was both a short-term sort of influence, but long-term, they've basically shown their hand. And I do believe it's like Sputnik, where they're saying, look at how much we've advanced technologically and capability-wise, and how vulnerable the West is to what we control. And I think we're just going to see more and more of that. And so I think it's very important that we have, and I appreciated the president made a strong statement. I'm sure he will try and have a productive meeting, but I don't think that's, the dialogue never seems to change the trajectory that the CCP is headed in.
Let's do one more quickly. We'll hope for quick question and quick answer, and we'll wrap as close to 11 as possible. Right there in the back.
Also from Reuters, we cover you very well. I just wanted to go back one more time to TikTok. You know, you mentioned that it's very important that the U.S. control the algorithm. If ByteDance were to end up, you know, in a situation where it was licensing the algorithm, would you say that that does not give the U.S. enough control? Thank you.
I would say it raises serious concerns. And I'm hoping to have a briefing on that specific topic. You know, I think anytime you have the CCP with leverage over the algorithm, I think that's a problem. You know, so you kind of have to look at what the contract says, what, you know, what all that is. But yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.